Hi everyone, my name is Afua Otto and I am the coordinator of Gender and Justice Initiatives at the Center for Court Innovation. I am in conversation today with the Honorable Judge Toko Sarita, and I think but we asked Mara to kind of not read our bios because that can be kind of awkward. And it's also a conversation today about the work, the people who do the work, and how we remain somewhat successful or kind of set some benchmarks for success for really addressing the needs of one of the most vulnerable populations to criminalization and incarceration. So I thank you all that have joined us today. I thank you for your work. I thank you for your ongoing efforts at professional development, but also keeping this conversation in the air as it is important and in light of current national trends in conversation. We no doubt have a new focus on vulnerable populations. And so, as to women of color, we are here to talk to you about really how we wrap around services for others vis-a-vis the wraparound approach to our work. I know that's a lot, but I'm going to turn now to Judge Sarita. Just a little bit, you can just hoping that you can provide a background, a little bit about your story. I think it'd be fun for people to know where you're from. I'm definitely a fan of that. And and then maybe go into the history of the treatment courts model, what led into prostitution diversion, and where you preside now. And then as we move through the slides, we'll be covering the impact of trauma on individuals and growth and development, no doubt, but also its relation to the pipelines to justice involvement, criminal legal justice involvement, as well as the impact of the treatment court model on individuals who come through the system. So I'm going to let you get started because I talk forever.
All right, good afternoon. I am here with a trainer extraordinaire in the form of Afua Otto, who I have had the pleasure of working with for several years now. And I wish that everybody participating in this webinar today could actually see the room that we are in, because I am surrounded by three African American women. I would like to introduce Tamara Chinloy, as well as Carlotta Walcott, and everybody's doing really tremendous work. So I feel honored to be here, and I also want to thank Center for Court Innovation for inviting me to this webinar today, as well as folks in the criminal justice system. My supervising judge, who also happens to be an African American woman by the name of Michelle Johnson, has been incredibly supportive of my efforts, and she has done a tremendous job overseeing Queens Criminal Court, as well as Sherry Klein Heitler, who is the who is the Chief Administrative Judge of the Office of Policy and Planning for the Office of Court Administration in New York State. So my name is Toko Sarita, and I preside over the Human Trafficking Intervention Court, the Queens Misdemeanor Treatment Court, which is the drug court, and the Mental Health Recovery Court. These are three treatment courts operating in misdemeanor criminal court in Queens County. And I have been in Queens since 2008, presiding over the Human Trafficking Intervention Court, which was the first court in the state solely dedicated to serving trafficking survivors and those arrested on prostitution charges. And in a little while, I will tell you more detail about the court. Afua has asked me to give a little bit of background detail about myself before we begin. So I am an Asian American woman born in Japan, and I came to this country as an immigrant when I was 5 years old. I'm the daughter of artist parents, which is always something that people find very, very interesting. And basically, my life as a lawyer has revolved around public service, and I've always been interested in women's issues. For several years before becoming a judge in 2005, I had been co-chair of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, which is a national organization working on APA women's rights. So I have been, really concerned about women's issues and had the great opportunity to start working on trafficking issues when I went to Queens. And at that time, I was a new judge in Brooklyn Criminal Court, and I saw a lot of female defendants, a lot of women of color, specifically young Black women and girls who were arrested on prostitution charges. And I thought that there was something very, very wrong with this picture. I had wanted to start a similar diversion court in Brooklyn as had been created by Fernando Camacho, who is a Latino judge. And he created the first court of its kind, I think, in New York State, if not the country, just to deal with alternatives to incarceration for women arrested on prostitution and loitering charges. And I think, what is important here is to note that, from the perspective of the judge, there was something fundamentally wrong with seeing female defendants in court arrested on charges who should not have been there in the first place. And then knowing beyond that they were being forced into prostitution and being exploited and brutalized, and that the court was just perpetuating, their victimization by not addressing the issue head on. So fortunately, as luck would have it, I had the opportunity to transfer to Queens because Judge Camacho had been promoted. And I wanted to take over his part, which was then known as the GEMS part for Girls Educational Mentoring Services, which is which is an organization that AFUA had belonged to many years ago. And when I started there, and this was around 2008, nobody was talking about trafficking. Nobody thought domestic, women and girls arrested on prostitution charges were trafficked at all. So that wasn't even part of the discussion. I also think, just to point out, the laws in New York State that have, been passed are pretty recent. They were passed in the past 10 years. And so that also had to do with the invisibility of domestic trafficking, domestic sex trafficking. So, we went from maybe 50 cases a year to 75 to 200, et cetera. And all of the prostitution cases were forwarded to my court. And eventually we got to the point where we were seeing, I think now about 600 cases a year. And what this court does is really to first acknowledge the existence of human trafficking, that many, if not most of the women who come before the court are victims of sex trafficking, and to provide services and alternatives to incarceration, but not to do it in a punitive or condescending way, but through a collaborative effort with stakeholders, with service providers, with defense attorneys, the prosecutor, so that we are all engaged in trying to, number one, assist and empower very marginalized and very vulnerable individuals who are coming before the court. Also to try to avoid criminal convictions and further harm. So this has been a model that has been quite successful. I have been talking for years about the need for a coordinated judicial response, meaning that we could not treat prostitution cases in the same way, especially with the understanding that we've had trafficking victims in the court. And as a result of these efforts, in 2013, Jonathan Littman, who is a former chief judge, decided to create 8 new trafficking intervention courts throughout the state, modeled on the Queens court. So I've talked enough. On this note, I'm going to pass the so-called mic back to AFUA.
Sure. Well, as we start talking about justice involved or women vulnerable to criminalization, specifically today on this webinar, Black women, women of African descent, women representing the diaspora, women from the Caribbean, um, and women who are African and immigrants and first generations, right? Everyone, just gonna pack it all in. And definitely not to negate the experiences of Afro-Latinas and Afro-Asian women and so on and so forth. For the sake of moving in the next hour or so, when we talk about women relative to research and data, we are not negating the experiences of trans women. And Judge, you have a lot of experience with trans folk through your court experience, definitely engaging and providing support to these women. But also, it's important that we are not negating the experiences of anyone outside of identifying as cisgendered and the binary. However, a lot of research studies within the last 10 to 15 years have been looking specifically at the experiences of cisgendered women relative to male identified victims and defendants. What's unique about women all across the board in this country entering the criminal legal system is that they are more likely to enter the system with pre-existing histories of abuse, trauma, and mental health disparities. And so while trends in the last 20 years have seen numbers decline for male incarceration and male offenders actually entering local, state, and federal prisons, the numbers have not declined for women, they've actually increased. There's been a decrease at the federal level, but then at the state and local level, those things have changed. And so what we see through the treatment court model is a movement away from incarceration, as you said, from a punitive response, and a movement toward meeting the needs of these individuals. And through, of course, assessment, of course, being women of color, we know that there are many needs that to this day are still not being met or even considered. Women do have different needs, physical needs, psychosocial needs, and also support upon reentry. And I think the treatment model that we'll be going more, in depth into takes into consideration a significant amount of trauma, specifically childhood and adolescent and young adult trauma. We know that this is important when we talk about the impact of identifying prostitution diversion because of the dynamics, the nuances in interpersonal relationships. And so when we're talking about trafficking and prostitution diversion, we're also talking about domestic violence, dating violence, essentially sexual assault and abuse. Because talking about trafficking kind of dredges up the idea, the concept of taken, right? Women kind of hoarded into packaging containers and sent across the nations and seas into other nations and forced to work. But what you were seeing early on in your court were young girls involved in relationships with individuals that were very hard to determine, and they themselves could not or would not readily identify themselves as victims of trafficking, further complicating providing support and services, and also conflating the fact that there are issues or concerns, pre-existing concerns for those women entering the system. So as we move forward, we're going to dial back a little bit and talk about how we talk about trauma to one another, but also how we share this with other judges and other stakeholders, other advocates. I do want to clarify, though, that in my position now as a gender and justice coordinator, I still do have some engagement with the defendants, individuals who come through the system, and had that in the past as an advocate, and then as well as a mental health counselor, being able to provide direct services to young women and men who needed support through their mandates or through their court involvement, through their legal involvement, and subsequently, continuum of care follow through. As we move into the discussion about the specific needs of Black women, the cultural responsivity piece is so important because of what representation means. Judge, can you talk a little bit, before we even start talking about trauma, can you talk a little bit about what you see as the most important aspect of cultural responsivity for vulnerable populations? It doesn't have to be too long.
Wow, that's very, very loaded concept. I don't even know where to start. I think we can start by saying that traditionally the criminal justice system has viewed women of color, has viewed African American women through a very biased lens. And I, do believe that they have been victims of different types of racism and sexism because of the lack of understanding of the role of, sexual assault, sexual violence in these women's lives. And so, without an understanding of how trauma works or the reality of gender violence, it is really difficult to see women coming before the court, understanding what their needs are, where they've been, and what we need to do in order to address their situation.
Right. So talking to individuals about trauma is always so interesting because we all experience it. We all make sense of it for our own experiences. It is as unique as our fingerprint, as unique as a snowflake. So no doubt, right? It results from an event, series of events or set of circumstances that an individual, whereby an individual feels their life has been threatened, and fears the safety of their life. And in the role of advocate, we must take into consideration the impact of interpersonal trauma and in the micro form and the macro systems that conflate traumatic experiences, the systemic and the structural oppressions that exist in society that make movement away from trauma, recovering from trauma, that much more difficult, or much more difficult to access support to recover from trauma, right? And how resilience how resilience individually is accessed relative to traumatic experiences. So everyone can experience a traumatic event, right? The person driving a car behind the wheel is going to experience that car accident very differently from the passenger, and very differently from the person in the back seat, and very differently from the person in the other car or the person standing on the sidewalk. That is how trauma works. What unfortunately doesn't happen with trauma is people have a very difficult time linking the adult to the childhood traumatic experience, or the adult to the adolescent child experience, or the adult to the results of how trauma moved and was recovered from in the life of that child. And so I always say that it's important that we take a look at trauma, because youth who experience childhood trauma are almost 60% more likely to be arrested as juveniles, and almost 30 of that group, almost 30% more likely to be arrested and or commit a violent crime by their 21st birthday. Okay, and that we know. I believe everyone in the audience that we're talking to, we know that. But how we talk to one another as court stakeholders, and then how we pass that information on to others, it really becomes a community response. It really becomes like a public health entity to pick apart and to understand. So now, as we talk about interpersonal trauma, discussing the systemic oppressions in place, and finding ourselves in that category can be off-putting. So moving towards trauma-informed care means understanding the impact of personal trauma relative to structural trauma, right? One's gender, one's race, economic status, sexual identification, and so forth, and other isms, as they move through the systems that some would say, or that seem to foster further victimization or further re-traumatization. So we see ourselves in that middle category, right? Some of us are working in the system, foster care system, and we are educators. How then are we able to peel back some of the layers that continue to oppress these individuals by readily identifying and understanding that people do have traumatic experiences and are always in recovery from them. So what does this mean? So this means, for those who want to find ways to explain this to people out there that you work with or in your lives, that if a major event happens, and I don't want to pick on one, but we're sitting in the middle of 34th Street, Times Square area in New York City. So if something happens outside and we all take off running, right? There's a loud noise, there's a boom, some kind of incitement of fear. We all take off running in different directions. You running, Judge, looks very different than me running, and it's going to look very different from the black man running. It's definitely going to look different from the white man running. And so by the time we are stopped in our place by law enforcement or a first responder, that individual's perception of fear themselves is going to dictate where we land. And some of us might go to the emergency room, and some of us might end up behind bars. And that understanding perception and just that disconnect between one's trauma reaction and response and how the reaction is received is really going to dictate how we move forward in trauma-informed care, where people land when they are in recovery. And it's important to understand that interpersonal trauma, sexual assault, domestic violence, childhood abuse, and severe neglect are definitely debilitating to the developing brain, the young, impressionable mind. But it is more, we find, studies have told us that we find a definite impact on girls, and that girls oftentimes are on the receiving end of neglect at a higher or twice the rate of boys. People love to debate me about the gender conversation when we're talking about women of color or men of color. But gender really is a delineating factor in this country. We are in the middle of a major gender conversation now. So there was a study conducted about, I think I mentioned this last year on another webinar, but I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about a study about how we respond to gender of infants in infancy, right? Before they can even talk, before they even identify themselves, 119 adults were given a fussy infant and asked to quiet that baby down. And every single adult asked what the baby was before they decided to quiet the baby down. The reason why is because they find that individuals who were told that the baby was a girl would soothe her and kind of, cajole her and try to make her happy, because the assumption was that she was sad, that her emotions were, that she wasn't uncomfortable, but that she emotionally was just displeased. And the response for the boy infant was that he was angry. And so almost instantaneously, this boy, or what was identified early on as a boy child, was being ascribed a secondary emotion, which is oftentimes ascribed to adults. Anger is the second emotion that comes from fear, it comes from embarrassment and or shame. And so almost before children themselves have a chance to identify their feelings and their emotions and gain a sense of their identity, they are being imposed upon with societal responses to trauma. This is how you will respond when you are not comfortable, or this is how you will respond when you are. And we then will respond to you, right? You boy child and you boy girl. This is important to take into consideration when we talk about trauma, because of what happens in adolescence as young people tend to gain a sense of independence and develop their sexual identity, and then of course just their identity, who they are in the world, and who they are in the world. And this is going to kind of veer off into another part of my counseling world, but that is important based on how they view authority figures in their early lives. And so if they were abused by and mistreated by an adult in their early adolescence, you then may interact with an adolescent who has a very difficult time respecting or acknowledging elders and authority figures as trusting individuals. Not that they're oppositionally defiant necessarily, but that they have a difficult time trusting. So as I talk about trauma and its impact on trauma reactions, right, and how people react and recover from their trauma experiences, I have to go into these different studies and conversations, because we oftentimes just think about that person right there, the individual who's hypervigilant, the person who shuts down, the individual who's ornery, the person who's cantankerous, or, these are all words used to describe aggressive or hard to place, or women that are difficult patients, difficult clients, difficult inmates, and so on and so forth. But those reactions are seen before that individual is incarcerated. And so they come into the courtroom in that way. And service providers are also tasked with having to interact with trauma responses quite often, because at the top of our systemic chart is court. And that legal experience can be quite re-traumatizing and re-victimizing. Individuals who are cuffed, individuals who are physically handled improperly just to make them uncomfortable, individuals who are just yelled at and screamed at or spoken to in a specific way. So as I said in the beginning, I could talk about this forever, but I want to move on to the next slide for a moment and explore along with the judge how many of these trauma reactions for so many of us, right? What they look like. Our trauma reactions look like, I'm just going to 7. Our trauma reactions look like self-coping, right? How we deal with something when it happens in our lives and we're trying to get back to normal. We're trying to feel normal and good again. Well, these trauma reactions are human reactions, things that the human body does to self-soothe. You might drink. You might engage in some substance use. There might be some depression, some anxiety. And then if you don't have access to adequate tools and support, those behaviors might become antisocial behaviors, behaviors that hurt or harm yourself or other people, such as violence and acting out, more re-victimization, revisiting dangerous places or people and things that make one vulnerable to re-victimization, but also self-mutilation and severe isolation, ways in which individuals will harm themselves that then might land them on the wrong side of the law. Judge, would this be a good time to jump in and have you jump in on what these trauma reactions mean?
Yes, because we see variations of
Yeah,
all
all
of
of them.
them in court. And I think that that's one of the reasons why it is very important for courts as well as other institutions to be trauma informed, to understand what is happening with the individual who is appearing before you. So, for example, in the Trafficking Intervention Court, I see many individuals who are in need of different types of intervention and services. And one of the positive things about the court has been our collaboration with service providers who are able to provide trauma-informed care, case management services, counseling services, et cetera. And also with the understanding that, people come from different backgrounds, and, to have the cultural sensitivity to understand that, there are a lot of interaction based on women's cultural backgrounds, language issues, the types of approaches or the the responses to the court system, which can be very, very frightening for many individuals who are coming into the court for the first time. And so having stakeholders or other people involved in this process who have an understanding of how trauma works is really essential to the care and services that we can provide for them.
Specifically here in New York City, we are no longer jailing women arrested, first offense on charges of prostitution or intention to solicit prostitution, right? Can you talk a little bit about what that means and how that's different from when we were responding with jail time or bail?
Sure. And I think that you can't go forward in this discussion without understanding how the traditional responses to prostitution had been, because up until very recently, first of all, because of the shame and stigma attaching to the commercial sex trade, a lot of people thought about these cases in criminal court as throwaway cases. Nobody ever bothered to even think about who the person was that was being arrested or if they were going through any kind of exploitation. So rather than connecting them to any kind of services, prosecutors, defense attorneys, the courts, everybody would try to dispose of these cases with, let's say, jail time or community service, et cetera, et cetera. hitting many of these defendants with criminal convictions, which had negative consequences for them at the time and also later. And so, this really presented a paradigm shift when we started looking at these victims in a really, really different way. Just to note that, okay, well, they don't belong in jail. They should not be punished. There's nothing wrong with what they did except to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And really experiencing a set of very, very unfortunate circumstances, which, as Afua had talked about, has a lot to do with their childhood experiences of trauma. Mm-hmm. So in terms of that shift, now I think there's a broader understanding, not only in these prostitution diversion courts, but within the criminal justice system itself, that many of the defendants that we see, many of the female defendants that we see, are in fact victimized by circumstances that we need to have a better understanding about.
I'm so glad you said that. Mara, can we jump to slide 12? Because last year around this time, myself and a colleague put this together to really, can people see that? I hope so. To see that there's a spectrum, as it says, of experiences and various entry points into the legal system, really for women. And we created this after our time with you at Queens Court. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that one of the things that's unique about the trafficking court program in New York City is court-based programs that support women and men who come through those courts. In addition to the service providers that are sprinkled throughout the city, we also have programming right within the court, working in tandem with other court-based services to provide direct responses to chronic acute trauma victims. Primarily because the entry points into the system are varied, but at this point, something that we've finally, or I think we're finally arriving at in New York City, at a point that a woman's history in trafficking or sexual exploitation has been identified, we then can start to have a better conversation, or a broader, more insightful conversation about the various experiences of these women, that women might be involved in a relationship carrying weapons or drugs for someone else, that they might be, in fact, involved in criminal activity of their own volition. But in addition to that, that racial profiling is an issue that we deal with as a community, that individuals living in highly policed communities, such as very large, impoverished public housing developments, where you have ongoing, you just have a 24-hour surveillance from the local police department in that area. How then can someone who is trying to survive, trying to make money legitimately, how do they look? Again, right? The trauma responses look very different for different people responding to them. How do you have a domestic dispute, nonviolent, with someone that you're involved in a relationship with, without the threat of a dual mandatory arrest, right? Victimizing someone who may just be in distress, or who might just having family conflict. How do we keep families together? How do we support families, in a sense, support women and Black women in these communities that are keeping their families together? What we know about incarceration of Black women is that the majority of these women that are incarcerated are the heads of their households. They are the primary breadwinners, and that when they're removed from the household, quite often there's very little interfacing with child services or family support services. What happens to those children? And as mass incarceration for men has increased and then decreased, but reentry has kind of waned, we're looking at communities that are not strong enough to support the children of women that have been incarcerated, not strong enough to support men returning and women returning. So we're talking through this project, through supporting projects, how to really get into communities and support faith-based communities, community-based organizations, and so on and so forth, with meeting these specific needs. So we're going to jump back to slide 9, because that's when that really highlights the treatment court model. It gives you an overview, Judge, of really the ways in which service providers kind of align their goals and their values to create this dynamic whereby individuals that are arrested, now I do want to be clear, the charge is prostitution, right? Am I saying that right?
Charges prostitution, loitering for the purposes of engaging in a prostitution arrest, or unlicensed massage. You know, basically performing massages without a license to do so. And those charges usually affect Asian women who have been arrested in massage parlors. So that's a whole different discussion going on. But in my court in Queens, I would say about 40% of the defendants that we have been seeing are Asian defendants, and most of them are from our foreign nationals, and they are in very specific situations in terms of their arrests for massage parlor offenses. And we have found at least 25% of those individuals have been victims of trafficking as well.
And when you say, what this information is so rich for people out across the country, because we have a very unique situation in New York because of the diversity here, because of the portal that Queens is. Can you talk a little bit about, and I know we're veering off of the Black women, but we're still talking about women of color. Talk a little bit about what that looks like in New York. So you're talking about massage parlor, that charge, right? Performing unlicensed massage. How does a woman end up there? Can you tell?
End up in court or end up in the massage parlor?
In the massage parlor.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, interestingly enough, Polaris is coming out with a report today on massage parlors and what's been going on throughout the country. So this is a very, very significant issue. But we've been seeing it in Queens for the last several years, and it fits into a pattern of women coming from China who are basically, borrowing a lot of money from debt smugglers in order to come to this country on the mistaken belief that they are going to be able to find legitimate employment once here. However, when they arrive in this country, and this is a very sophisticated network of not only travel agencies, visa suppliers, massage parlors here, etc. But once they come here, they realize that the legitimate employment that they had been promised doesn't really exist, and they are coerced and coerced into performing sex in the massage parlors themselves. And so this is a situation that is really across the board happening in many different places, and many of the women in Queens are being arrested in other places as well. So what we have done in the last several years is really to partner with several different organizations that provide culturally sensitive and also language appropriate services in Mandarin or in Korean, so that these women can get services from these organizations.
It's great. I'm sorry, I was just
That's okay.
paying attention to what you were saying and drinking at the same time. I forgot that I'm a participant in this as well. I'm glad that you were able to break down the experiences of Asian women come through the court, because that is almost so drastically different than Black women that come through. And I think what's difficult for Black women is that they don't have the foreign national experience to kind of round out how they end up arrested for this charge, or how they become vulnerable to arrest. And so where are we finding these women, and how do we figure that out? As we move on to the next slide, we find out and have been able to figure out how to better respond to these individuals vis-a-vis an assessment. This is like the buzzword here in Queens now. Assessment. How do we assess? Assessment, intake, initial engagement. A lot of this happens in a very short amount of time, very quick. I will say, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the astounding work of social workers in supporting and providing comprehensive care, but I'm not one. And so my assessment is a little different. I'm really trying to, and after years of working directly with youth, trafficked youth survivors at GEMS, at Girls Educational Mentoring Services, you you learn how to kind of have this conversation with people, the terms, the lingo, the dictionary of the life or of the purported life, right? The life meaning sex work, prostitution, sexual exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation of children. Empowering the individual to tell you themselves how they identify their trauma history, I think is key. Individuals don't then have to go into the history of who provided the abuse and who did so on and so forth. But many individuals will tell you that they know when and where the issue started. We are the captains of our fate. We know our lives. We know our life stories. And after some time and parents, we can share that. What we don't ultimately always know is how to fix things or how to put the pieces together in order to move forward, how to build resiliency in our life, how to acknowledge and address those. And that takes time, that takes years, and everyone doesn't have the wherewithal and the needs, to do that. But the assessment provides everyone with an understanding of when and where this person entered into this work. Are you involved with someone who is forcing you, coercing you, or fraudulently engaging you in a dynamic that to sell yourself for sex, and that money then is passed on to someone else? That's how we identify sexual exploitation. And then we also identify whether that's ever been a part of their history, because if it's ever been a part of their history, we then can sometimes identify early adolescent or childhood abuses that provided a pipeline to sexual abuse and victimization. And then working as a collective, all of the service providers throughout the HCICs are in collaboration with one another through a task forcing of sorts, provide these trauma-informed services. We just got a really good question about what to do about denial in responses to trauma. Yeah, there's a lot of denial. Most trauma responses are denial of that experience, because to remember, to acknowledge is to sometimes, for many, to relive and to revisit very painful past. And so I think what's most important about this work in engaging hyper vulnerable populations is not siloing the responsibilities, but delegating and making comprehensive and collaborative the approach to supporting these individuals. They need short-term and long-term support. So they're going to need immediate responses. And we work with city officials here to kind of meet the needs of our homeless and our housing insecure and our food insecure. But we also keep the conversation going through opportunities like this to talk about the long-term impact of a lack of reentry support or the lack of trauma informed curriculum in substance abuse and sex assault support services. And so we meaning stakeholders and individuals on the task force, service providers, I think continually go above and beyond to try to find ways to meet the needs of victims and victim defendants. And we talk about victim defendants. I know that's very provocative. That's the word you used, Judge, many moons ago. But we're talking about individuals who are arrested for the committal of a crime, but they themselves are victims in their lives, or for whom the actual crime is a victimization. And that's where we end up with the sexual exploitation. But it's also important to acknowledge that there are women who are surviving.
Absolutely.
And being punished for trying to feed families, feed themselves, sustain independent employment, and working to build capacity and improving those responses and resources and meeting those needs. And so we do not only work with service providers to help walk these women through the justice system, but also with sex positive agencies that come in and listen and lend their support to sex workers that are also vulnerable. Project Safe last year is sponsored through is funded through the Justice Department Office on Violence Against Women, and really meets the needs of the disproportionate representation of victims of domestic violence and sexual assault in the legal system, specifically Black women. I think we're looking at 8 out of 10 women that are incarcerated at the federal and local levels report histories of domestic violence and sexual assault, again, coming into the system with pre-existing trauma histories. We are working on this project along with the National Black Women's Justice Institute, which does amazing, extensive work, and actually wrote the book, yes, last year on the sex abuse to prison pipeline. Dr. Monique Morris wrote Push Out. And it's a great anthology of the experiences of young women and young girls who were traumatized for school and community punitive responses to their own trauma responses, and just their girls being girls phases in their lives. We've also partnered up with the Black Women's Blueprint that has done extensive work on college campuses, and specifically historically Black colleges and universities, to respond to school kind of like local judiciary responses to sexual assault, and building capacity to have these conversations and provide actual curriculum and training assistance to colleges and universities. And we have brought on the Reverend Dr. Cheryl Dudley from American Baptist Churches Metropolitan to really support us in having a conversation about the responses or the lack thereof of faith-based communities for justice-involved women, and the conversation around domestic violence and sexual assault. And together we will all be creating some tools and really some fact sheets for individuals out there to kind of tap into, to really access some of the tools shared by all of these amazing individuals to start really kind of producing I'm sitting here with my hands out, right? Like tangible curriculum for individuals that we can take back to communities and say, this is how we can support these individuals. This sounds like a huge undertaking, but in my mind and after all these years of work, I really think that it's something that can be done, a conversation that we can move toward. I have a question for the audience, and then we'll get back to ourselves. And that is, if the audience has any experience with training on trauma-informed service specifically. So if you can answer that in the Q&A box. The chat box. Yes, the chat box. Tell us if you've been trained on trauma-informed care. I mean, really trained on trauma, if you feel comfortable providing that service and support. And then later on, we're going to poll you again to find out what else you all know. But as we move through this, we're back to talking about the different entry points for justice-involved victim defendants. And I think I overtalked. I went past my goal. We're down on 14, I believe. Yes, the next one. There we go. Well, yes, here we are again. More than 8 out of 10 Black women engaged in the criminal justice system here in the U.S. are survivors of domestic violence and sexual abuse. And so it's important that state and local governments do implement gender-responsive strategies to support women, specifically Black women. And this is what we're doing today. This is really what I hope Project SAFE, and then working along with you, Judge, and you working and managing the task force of judges throughout the state can improve upon for women. I think we're headed down a brighter path as we're not jailing so many women arrested on charges of prostitution, because what we also know here in the city is that charge can mean a lot. Oftentimes it is lawyering. But I'm going to step away from there for a second and talk a little bit about the impact, the goal of trauma-informed services, and what we hope that it would do. Yeah, right there. Effective interventions for justice-involved women are geared towards first removing stigma and pathology, and that is handled really through empowering the individual to identify their own trauma history. And I think it's important to note that we are talking about a vulnerable population. We are talking about a population that has a history of exposure to traumatic experiences in this country. However, we are also talking about a population of individuals who have an incredible amount of resilience and strength within their community and within themselves and in their families, right? And so it's important not to pathologize their experiences as all traumatic. Can you tell me a little bit about how you do that, Judge?
Oh,
I talked a lot, but it's time to hear from you again.
that's okay. How do I do that in the courtroom? You know, even though we consider many of the women who come through the Trafficking Intervention Court as victims/defendants, we use the term victim in a very specific way. Not that, you know, they deserve help and that they're, you know, very vulnerable and helpless and just in need of a guiding hand. That is not it at all. We use that term specifically in a legal context, you know, as a victim of sex trafficking. Because it does have legal connotations. However, one of the things that I try to do in the courtroom is really to provide restorative justice. So what does that mean? And a lot of people use that term, you know, restorative justice, procedural justice, or transformative justice, etc. But it's really to try to change the nature of the experience, right, for defendants who are coming into the courtroom so that, for example, we can provide a safe space so that we're not just recriminalizing and re-traumatizing these individuals, because that is an experience that they are encountering, you know, based on the arrest for these charges. And it's really just, and it's a very, very simple formula. It's nothing incredibly complex or complicated. It's treating somebody with dignity, with civility as a human being, right? So, you know, everybody who comes before the court is accorded that at a minimum. I don't try to be everybody's best friend. I don't have enough access to these individuals to develop relationships because the contact with the court is so brief, but at least I can engage them in a way that respects their humanity and their dignity. And I think that one of the things that we're trying to do in these courts in terms of understanding the role of trauma, et cetera, is really to try to create situations of empowerment, right? So what can we do to start empowering some of the most disenfranchised and vulnerable people that we see? And this is something that I believe everybody who participates in the courtroom has a clear understanding about. In terms of what happens in my court, we have at least like 9 direct service providers that we collaborate with who come to court and serve as court advocates. And so they are there in the courtroom to not only provide representation and support, but really to make contact with many of the defendants so that they do not feel as alienated and are in fear of the whole process, because we do understand that it can be a very, very intimidating and scary thing to be a criminal defendant in the courtroom.
Absolutely. Listen, I'm so glad you said that, because one of the major components, I think, for many of the service providers out there today are some of the tools, the principles that guide our work. And someone just posted, who was that? Lynn Rocker had just posted about the what is it? The 5 domains of well-being, which I'm glad she talked about, because I'm glad you brought that up, Lynn, because the judge just talked about social connection, right? That's the first thing. So we ensure. This is also to answer someone else's questions about the short-term versus the long-term services provided directly in HTICs. I think we're going off script and we're just going to get those slides. Just answer your questions. Right, so initially we want advocates in the courtroom so individuals can meet them and secure some stability. So essentially, we're not providing direct stability, right? They're not going to leave and go to either a shelter or their own very own apartment right away, but they have a connection to someone who's going to either be their caseworker, their advocate, period, moving forward. They know the next time they come to court, who's going to be there waiting for them and who they can interact with, the name of their attorneys and the DA on the case, or the ADA on the case. And so I think the specific short-term services afforded to individuals in the HTICs in your court right now, and not just trafficking court, right? Mental health and the treatment drug court are directly engaging with someone that is going to support them through this process. And stability is ascertained or assessed in that brief assessment, that intake. Are you in acute chronic trouble or crises right now? So there's a significant amount of crisis intervention and harm reduction that's implemented upon the first initial meeting. And this meeting happens after the individual's arraigned and then at their first court date, right? Their first court date very well might even be their last, depending on what their needs are, as well as their safety. So that harm reduction work, that crisis intervention, is also assessing their safety, but assessing their safety for a return to the court. Now, it's important to note, we're not using court involvement to keep someone safe. We're using the mandate, right, the law as it stands. We're definitely not breaking them. I'm trying not to break the law. Trying. But to also engage that individual in a way that they are empowered through the process with the understanding that this isn't a death knell, right? Like, this isn't a sentence. This is not a mark on your permanent record for life, that there is a way through and out this, right? And we can talk about 440s when we get back to that as well. There is also a meaningful connection to support services by having advocates in the courtroom, by having advocates that are dedicated and have an understanding of that court part, that work with other agencies to really provide wraparound services. And then finally, it honors someone's survival in that experience, that you're not just handing them a referral to an agency and expecting them to go somewhere, but acknowledging the fact that they've been through enough, and that this isn't going to just add on to the weight of their experiences. And so I think in addition to that harm reduction, we're also trying to meet their basic needs if that's what they need. Sometimes I've been asked for just a cigarette, and I can't provide that right away, but I'm aware that that's sometimes someone's essential need, especially if they've just been released from holding or jail. No doubt, their immediate needs are very different from what I assume. And so I have to empower that individual by definitely asking that question. And the long term, I think, is the policy work we do outside of court, working with local constituents to increase the conversation about shelter beds specifically for survivors of trafficking, domestic violence, and trafficking and sexual assault. Meeting the needs of trans folk who have a very difficult time accessing current shelter facilities, meeting the needs of chronically homeless, right? What that means for couch surfers here in New York. Couch surfers who are incredibly vulnerable to sexual exploitation. A majority of our aged-out foster youth are vulnerable to housing insecurity. And so we do take that very seriously and work with local agencies that can provide immediate shelter beds for individuals for whom walking out of court can be just as insightful as working in the streets or being vulnerable to law enforcement. We have another question about housing for criminalized women and having a record bars access to DV shelters, etc. It does, and here in New York, we work really hard so that it doesn't. Our local DV crisis center did have, we came head to head over the last couple of years about this. And what we found is if we can identify a history of trafficking, or we can identify significant victimization, that there are some facilities that will open. And so we've created alliances here in New York. I think it's called the Women's Community Justice Project. Small cohort of shelters run by various agencies that come together to provide support for women that are hard to place. women with children, women with pets, women with violent criminal histories, or women with mental health disparities. And so that's difficult, far and wide. We don't have many beds, but we're getting there. The city identified 111 shelter beds last year for aged out foster youth who find themselves at the doors of shelters, unable to be placed, as well as trans youth that are also aged out. So we're working. I don't want to say we as in just myself, but I think we're part of conversations to meet these needs, because if you're out there and you're in America, you know that housing insecurity fuels significant vulnerabilities to criminalization, no doubt. So do you have anything you want to add on that piece as we keep going?
In terms of what, long-term and short-term strategies? Yeah. I just want to make the point that as far as my court is concerned, or trafficking intervention courts, the prostitution offenses are usually B misdemeanor offenses. So that means the maximum amount of time that somebody can be sentenced on this offense is 90 days. Accordingly, the services that we are able to provide in the court mandate is necessarily short. And what will happen is if somebody is arrested on a prostitution charge, let's say first, second offense, etc., they will have the opportunity to get their case dismissed if they participate in services. And usually it's like 5 to 7 sessions, maybe in extreme cases about 10 sessions. So obviously that does not provide for the possibility of long-term support. But one of the ways that we have found this to be a measure of success is those individuals who continue voluntarily with the programs even after their mandate is completed, even after their criminal case is resolved. And so I think that that's something that we have been seeing, which has been really successful. The other thing is that if somebody is in need of longer term care or intervention, especially if they have substance use or mental health issues, I am able to transfer their cases into either the mental health court or drug treatment court. And there, the model of the treatment court is very different, because that is usually a 9-month mandate. And so that might be a little bit similar to other prostitution diversion courts around the country, which have much longer mandates, sometimes a year or 2 years, which are also modeled on the drug courts. But, you know, this is something that differentiates, I think, our trafficking intervention courts from the other courts.
I'm so glad you mentioned the mandates and sanctions in other jurisdictions, because we've met with different delegations from across the country and have been shocked by some of the responses. We just got a question about what recidivism looks like for women who have been living in shelters or who have experienced time in shelters. I think the question is something like, do you see problems with women returning to human trafficking from shelters? But before I even talk about shelters, the issue of human trafficking is really an issue of how women are valued in this society, right? And so that a woman or a child or a man can be sold and resold by someone else, it is really about how we place value on other individuals. I do think it's important to note, and Judge, I'm coming back to you in a second to talk about the victim-defendant thing, but I'd be remiss if I didn't note that when we're talking about across the nation numbers for trafficking, then relative to the populations in this country, the numbers are highest for Native women, first and foremost, relative to again, their overall national populations. And
are you talking about arrests?
Of arrests,
Okay.
and then the exploitation of Native women and Native girls, and then Black girls and Black women, and then Latina girls and Latina women, Asian women and girls, and then white women and girls. And so we're really with consumers not looking like that. I think the majority of consumers, I think 60% white male, and then from there white male, Latino male, Asian male, and then Black male. Consumers of sex and exploiters of individuals in the trade. And individuals out there. We don't want to make this a trafficking specific
Right.
talk,
Right.
but I think it's important to just get an idea of what those numbers look like, what the data it looks like, and who we're seeing coming in and out. And so I think what's challenging again about Black women in the legal system is that it can be very difficult to acknowledge them as victims, as individuals in need of care and support, just because of that systemic
Racism.
exactly,
And
point blank,
sexism.
right, period, right. And so we're also, I think recidivism is one of the things we don't look at to mark as a marker of success of the program and of the project, because we're always going to, because it's almost impossible not to see the victimization of women. So I don't know that specifically we've seen women return from shelters, going back to that question.
Oh, right,
But-
yeah. You know, I think more generally, a discussion about recidivism is important. I don't know that we can really differentiate whether or not that happens more with women from shelters versus those from other places. But this might be a good time just to talk about a few concepts that Afua just mentioned, you know, in terms of not only recidivism, but sanctions and what that means. I totally agree with her in the sense that, you know, the problem stems from the fact that women of color, especially Black women's lives, are so devalued and rendered invisible that we cannot really see the harm that has been done to them. And as a result, we cannot respond adequately as an institution, you know, as part of the criminal justice system, for example. And that is something that has bothered me for quite some time. I look at the contradiction, right, as a judge and within the justice system of punishing and criminalizing individuals who are in fact victims. And right now I'm using that word in a very, very specific way. I think that this contradiction has to be addressed head on by talking about these issues, by addressing trauma, by addressing mass criminalization, etc. Mass incarceration, excuse me. But one of the features that differentiates the trafficking intervention courts from, let's say, traditional drug treatment courts is that the model is necessarily different. Drug treatment courts are successful because they reduce the recidivism, and that is a very compelling reason why we should be providing this kind of treatment. You know, for people who are skeptics, this is really a very effective way of countering those arguments, right? But recidivism in the context of, let's say, trafficking or prostitution, this necessarily happens when somebody is in the life involuntarily is being trafficked, then you're going to see them rearrested a number of times because they might not have any voluntary, or they might not have any choice in what they're doing. They might be under the control of a pimp. They might not have many resources, etc. So, you know, we understand that the number of times an individual might be arrested may have nothing to do with how their case should be resolved. Obviously, it's not a good thing, but if somebody comes if a defendant is before me with arrests in other counties, I'm not going to put her in jail by saying, oh, well, you're not being good, you're not, going to the program, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. You're not a perfect victim, right? So it entails an understanding of how recidivism works in this context. Similarly, in terms of incentives and sanctions, if somebody gets rearrested, they should not be sanctioned for that necessarily. I have never put anybody in jail because they've gotten rearrested on another prostitution charge. It just does not make sense. More to the point, it's like, well, what is going on with this individual? How can we help this person, right? So she does not get rearrested, so she can lead a more empowered existence, or she can have the resources to escape her trafficker. I mean, I think that these are the questions that we need to be asking rather than being in this kind of punitive role.
Absolutely. And I
Right.
think pressing individuals for the how and why uh, sex work is functioning in their lives can also be punitive. You know, individuals are not always ready to leave.
Right.
And so what is similar about the drug treatment model is the return rate. That it might take someone 7 to 8 tries to complete drug treatment. It might take a woman or an abused individual 7 to 8 times to leave that abusive dynamic, be it an intimate partner or a pimp or a sexual exploiter or a drug dealer who is holding you you know, kind of holding you for rent, holding that for ransom. So and take that into consideration because primarily because it can be difficult to measure success, right? And how individuals move through the system and if they get out of the system and ultimately understanding that everyone has very unique circumstances. So we are taking into consideration the nuances of relationship, the complexities of community, the unique dynamics of culture. We have so many cultures represented here in New York, and every time someone steps into the room, they're representing a different angle of cultural experiences. And so that's, I think, one of the ways in which multiple wraparound services are necessary. You just said something that made me think about what happens to individuals this for whom sex work is a not just a choice, but maybe even a profession or maybe a way of their own life, and find themselves hyper victimized or criminalized. And so if they do find themselves arrested or charged and summons or desk appearance ticket, whatever it may be, we also can connect them to support health services. You know, we're I think when we think about short-term and long-term services, we're just thinking about like counseling and getting them in and out of a shelter. But we also align ourselves with sex positive shelters. We work with a clinic here, not shelter, excuse me, clinic, health clinic. We work with a clinic here called the Purple Clinic that only operates on Sundays, is closed to the public, and only operates for individuals with a history of sex work and trafficking and exploitation, run by all women. And she can make direct referrals to services for trans folk and for men if they do require that and are more comfortable in that sense. And I think that that's wholly unique because we then avoid re-stigmatizing individuals who are engaged in sex work. And I think I don't want to condone anyone's life experiences. And again, everyone is coming with pre-existing histories. And so by the time they get to us, it's important that we provide access to a very diverse lot of services and support. I do have another question coming in.
I just want to interject right now by saying that, another key element in terms of the court is that we don't function in a judgmental way. We're not here to pass judgment on people's choices, especially if they are engaged in sex work voluntarily. I have no interest in engaging in a political discussion about the commercial sex trade, et cetera. I really feel that for the most part, what we do on the front lines with the individuals who appear before us is very specific, is not about getting into any kind of ideological battle, but really trying to meet the needs of the women who are before us. So I just want to put that out there. The other thing is, I don't know, well, I'll be very, very blunt about this. I don't believe that we should have prostitution and loitering charges. I think that is incredibly destructive, and in the way that these offenses are applied, they serve to really harm and victimize most of the women that we see. And so we need to start making those connections. Going after having sex trafficking offenses or going after consumers, et cetera, that is an entirely different issue. In our court, we do not see sex trafficking cases. We don't we're not involved in cases involving pimps or exploiters or consumers of sex.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for saying that. I think that's important. And I think it's important for the audience to hear that we don't just think about this work in the function of your courtroom, but you think about the policy beyond that. I mean, I would hope that people assume that you think that way.
I don't know.
But I don't know. I don't know. It's hard. It's hard from the top down in this country. It is hard to assume what people are thinking, right? Um, I also, one of the questions we just received was about trauma. I'm glad we got this question. Is the main challenge that African American, Black women face in general in the criminal justice system just being re-traumatized? I think it's important to note this. This conversation is important, doubly important, because Black women wake up in a nation with told that the target on their back is in fact on the back of the men in their lives, their sons and their husbands and their intimate partners and dads and uncles and brothers. And so the concerns of Black men and their engagement with law enforcement and the criminal and mass incarceration has received so much spotlight that more so the experiences of criminalized Black women have become further and further more invisibilized, as you said. I think that's traumatizing, that I am not secure in my engagement with law enforcement or with the justice system as someone who has not even offended. And so I think the anticipation, the fear, remember, trauma is not the actual incident. The incident is objective. We know it happens. We know a car accident happens. We've got proof that the tsunami happens. We have proof that Hurricane Katrina. We know that something has occurred. The impact on the individual is very specific to that person. And then their trauma response is what is being criminalized. And so if I have engaged with I'm on the side of the road, I've been pulled over for a broken taillight, and the individual approaching me is taking me back in my memory to something that is going to make me respond in a way. How that law enforcement agent responds to me is going to determine where I end up in the system. Will I be cuffed? Will I be let go? Will I receive a ticket? Will I receive a fine? And then will I live? And I think what I just ran through was Sandra Bland's story in a sense. And I'm very similar to her in that I drive alone all the time. And I don't want to be pulled over, right? I've got some place to go.
Yes.
And so when we're talking about re-traumatization, I think we're talking about the intent of the actions in terms of how we engage inmates and defendants once they're within the system. We're talking about the intentions of those systems, the intentions of those strategies, those response strategies of these agencies and these organizations. And what we're working toward is providing training and professional development so that their perception of individuals shifts relative to that individual's trauma recovery. I hope that answers the re-traumatization question. I would really try to stay on task with the question, but I'm a New Yorker and we go all over the place to answer a question. I can't help it. I do want to ask, as we get down to the final 10 minutes, if anyone does have any more questions to share. And I want to thank you all again yes, I hope this was informative. I learned a lot today too from your questions, just really where your thinking is about this population. But also, Judge, we talk all the time, but I really enjoy hearing you, specify the needs of Black women and really talk about the needs of Asian women through your court. I think it's really important for the nation to hear this because we're in a city where our populations are much larger, but throughout the nation, that dwindles. And so the experiences of Black women and of Asian women can oftentimes get lost or kind of just become a very localized, urbanized, response in a sense. So I do appreciate hearing you talk about this. Do you have anything that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think representation Diversity and representation issues are really important. When I started working in the Trafficking Intervention Court, there were very, very few Asian women as defendants, and no services available for them. So that I remember we had one Asian woman, and there was a 6-month backlog for her to be able to meet with a service provider, right? So, we've come a long way since then, but I also believe that it is really important as a judge to be able to represent your community. So, to the extent that there have been an increasing number of Asian women in my court, having an Asian woman who is a judge, I believe, is really important on so many different levels. One of the things I wanted to respond to what Efua was talking about before, I think is very unfortunate that women of color, especially Black women, are forced to choose between different communities and different issues. I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind when we talk about intersectionality is that these issues are playing simultaneously all the time. And so we have to start looking at it from a very, very different perspective. And I think that, oftentimes we are silenced because we have to really identify what our primary commitment is or who our community is. But in order to start looking at solutions, remedies, alternative ways of approaching the issues, I think we have to say, let's stop dealing in that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am so glad you brought up the word intersectionality because I tried to have this conversation without saying it over and over again. We have one question about violent offenders. I think you can probably answer this, but I do have an experience. One of my very first clients when I was at Jim's actually was a young adult who had been trafficked since she was 14 and had been jailed on a attempted murder charge. And we worked together for years, and then I didn't see her for years, and then we ran into each other last year at another facility, and she had gone through and experienced some trauma counseling, some intensive trauma work, and finally had an opportunity to explain her crime and her part in the crime, and had insight into really what happened to her mind and her physical being at the moment she was interacting with this individual, and then she aggressed. And she was able to identify that she blacked out and that she kind of dissociated and committed this crime and had paid for it, or had paid her debt to society, and was now really trying to get a handle on her life. But what she appreciated was that she went to jail and she felt like the other inmates, the other women, always saw her as a victim. And so I think the treatment court model, if we can, impose upon individuals who are working with these women, engaging them, we then can reduce to other individuals' question the re-traumatization through the system, and through their experiences through the legal system as well. But Judge, can you talk real quick, 2 seconds, about how we would handle a violent individual? Or I think that comes in the collaboration and comprehensive work effort is what we go back to.
So, for example, I don't see many defendants who are charged with violent offenses because they would probably be seen in a Supreme Court that handles felony offenses. But I do think that what has been happening in those cases is that the defense attorneys will usually provide some kind of report or an assessment to really outline, what the trafficking victim circumstances may have been. And so that is certainly taken into consideration by the court. It's not like anybody gets a free pass for being trafficked, but it helps to provide context and understanding for the circumstances and what may have transpired at that time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's really helpful to the history and taking into consideration the trauma history. And as more and more judges and prosecutors are trained on trauma-informed responses, we'll start to see the impact of trauma histories and acknowledge it, as well as substance abuse service providers and mental health service providers, really kind of folding in the impact of domestic violence and sexual assault for many of these women. It's the best way we can approach this. I also think it's important to acknowledge question about how we support women, how we get women to leave. I love the word get in support services because we can't get anyone to do anything. If you have children, you know you cannot get anyone to do anything. But what you can do is provide an open door.
Yes.
You can provide ongoing access, and I think open doors are really important. A lot of programs, grants programs, I know it's hard, you got to close out cases, but I think this is when the spirit can kind of step in and push the boundaries, the rules aside, and open doors are really helpful for individuals who are living in the street and are very vulnerable to hypercriminalization, so that individuals can come back. I also think it's important that you keep in mind as the providers that trafficked individuals are experiencing the same power and control dynamics as individuals under substance abuse and individuals in acute domestic violence situations. And so it will take time. And I think it's important that open communication about really what this process is important. It's going to be hard for you to walk away from this individual that is providing you basic needs and also building you up every now and then before they tear you back down. So building that level of trust with someone. And I think it's important to vet staff. You know, sometimes we got to go back through our staff and retrain. Sometimes individuals are experiencing burnout and frustration, and we talk self-care a lot, but sometimes self-care is a career switch. And I just want to be honest about the fact that you might need to step away from being inundated with this work in order to come back and really provide your best work. I'm not advocating that everyone quit. Definitely not. That is not the goal of this. The point is specifying the needs of Black women through the justice system. And I think that when it comes to the intersections of their needs, because they are so complex, it's important. It's that much more necessary that employees and workers and direct service providers are well equipped to provide adequate, equitable care to these women and their families. I want to thank Tamara Chinmoy for her support. She has been the producer of this webinar. I'm going to let her send us out, but Judge, I want to thank you for taking the time to come out here and talk with Jess. She came all the way out here, meaning she came
Only from Queens,
came all the way in from Queens. But if you know anything about the New York subway system, you know that was about a 2-hour jaunt. And so thank you for your time. Thank you to all of our staff and our supporters and our colleagues. And so, Mara.
Yes, thank you both so much, Afua and Judge Sarita. I think by all accounts, this was an extremely informative and engaging presentation. For everybody on the line, I will be sending out a follow-up email with a recording of this webinar in the next several days, as well as some related resources and things that folks might have been asking. We do also want to announce something regarding Project SAFE. So in the next couple of days or so, we will be launching a Google forum for Project SAFE. So all of you should receive an invitation in the next few days or so to join that. Basically, it's just an email listserv where folks can post questions, share resources, things like that. So stay tuned. You'll be getting that invitation. And yeah, and we'll also be sending out those resources. So again, thank you both so much, Judge Sarita and Nifa. And thank you everybody on the phone or on the Adobe Connect, I should say, for tuning in. And have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thank you.
Great. want to thank Tamara
Yay.
Chinmoy, for her support. She has been the producer of this webinar. I'm going to let her send us out, but Judge, I want to thank you for taking the time to come out here and talk with us. Yes, she came all the way out here, meaning she came
Only from Queens.
came all the way in from Queens. But if you know anything about the New York subway system, you know that was about a 2-hour jaunt. And so thank you for your time. Thank you to all of our staff and our supporters and our colleagues. And so, Mara.
Yes, thank you both so much, Afua and Judge Sarita. I think by all accounts, this was an extremely informative and engaging presentation. For everybody on the line, I will be sending out a follow-up email with a recording of this webinar in the next several days, as well as some related resources and things that folks might have been asking. We do also want to announce something regarding Project SAFE. So in the next couple of days or so, we will be launching a Google forum for Project SAFE. So all of you should receive an invitation in the next few days or so to join that. Basically, it's just an email listserv where folks can post questions, share resources, things like that. So stay tuned. You'll be getting that invitation. And yeah, and we'll also be sending out those resources. So again, thank you both so much, Judge Sarita and Nifa. And thank you everybody on the phone or on the Adobe Connect, I should say, for tuning in. And have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thank you.
Great.